All right, we are at 12:01 and we have a chock full big agenda today. And so we are just going to go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for being here today. We really appreciate it. And welcome to our ongoing series dedicated to voter service training. Today we present Eligible but Excluded, Removing the Barriers to Jail Voting. We have a superstar lineup of guest speakers that will go into a deep dive on why this issue is so important, the current policies related to voter registration and voting for currently and previously incarcerated populations, how to help correct misinformation and misunderstanding about voter rights for this population, and how to remove barriers to voting for this population. Before I introduce our first speaker, I'd like to go over some housekeeping. Please use the chat section to comment and the Q&A section to ask any questions so that we are sure not to miss any of those. We will have a dedicated Q&A at the end of this webinar. Also, we have enabled closed captioning for this webinar, but you will need to press the CC button at the bottom of your screen on the menu there to actually see the captioning. And finally, please subscribe to our YouTube page so that you can get notifications for this and other webinars when they are posted online. Anyone who registered for this webinar will receive the supplementary materials by tomorrow, including the recording for this webinar. And now, I am so pleased and honored to introduce our first guest who will start the program off for us, Reverend Raymond Greene, who is the Executive Director of the Freedom BLOC, and that is BLOC, the Black-led Organizing Collaborative. Raymond has been working to provide job training, jobs, and education in the Black community since walking out of prison in 2001, hiring and training over 2,000 people in direct sales through canvassing in Ohio, New Jersey, Philadelphia, Detroit, and Pittsburgh. He used those skills to build the largest voter registration team in the country from 2012 to 2018, registering over 500,000 Black people over that time span. Raymond, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. How are you?
So the thing that, like, people just, I guess, aren't too fond of signing up.
I'm sorry, one of our speakers might have some background noise. Alice, if you could help me take care of that, one of our speakers might have some background noise. Raymond, you go ahead, please. Sorry about that.
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
How are you?
We're doing well. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I am Ray Greene, Executive Director of the Freedom BLOC. Working to eliminate the stigma around those of us who have been incarcerated. Being a 4-time convicted felon myself, I have seen all of the roadblocks that comes with being a formerly incarcerated person. The work that we do is the work of relieving those laws, changing those policies, and ensuring that everyone has a chance to take care of their families in a dignified way. We fight for living wages. We fight for leadership development from the incarcerated people, and fight to allow them to access to the workforce, access to education, and access to all the benefits that every other citizen in the United States and Ohio are allowed to have. And I am thankful of being here, being asked to be here today. I'm honored to be here today and look forward to this discussion.
Thanks so much for joining us, Raymond. We appreciate your starting off the program for us. And next, I am pleased to introduce Collin Marozzi, who serves as the Deputy Policy Director for the ACLU of Ohio. Collin's work is primarily focused on enacting criminal justice reforms, ensuring equal protection for the LGBTQ community, and expanding voting rights. Before joining the ACLU, Collin spent over 2 years working in the Ohio legislature. During his time in the General Assembly, Collin worked on the measure to reform Ohio's congressional redistricting process that went on the May 2018 ballot as issue 1 and passed with nearly 75% of the vote. Thanks so much, Collin, for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you, Nazik, and Thank you to all the other panelists here, and thank you for the invitation to come speak with you all today. I am going to take a couple minutes here and talk about kind of the basic legal framework for jail voting and helping to administer elections in jails by groups such as the League of Women Voters, Freedom Bloc, other civic organizations. I'm going to just the basics because I want to make sure to reserve time for questions and from our actual on the ground discussion by my fellow panelists, Lynne and Meredith. So I'm going to share my screen. I just have a couple of slides that I want to put up for everybody so we can talk about why it's important for jail voting and what are the parameters for conducting a jail voting program. So, okay, so let's see here. So I think the first thing, and Reverend Greene nailed this in his introduction, but why are we so focused on jail voting, or why should we be so focused on jail voting? And the biggest reason is that essentially, as the title of this presentation says, though people in Ohio jails are eligible to vote, they very oftentimes are excluded from the vote. And in Ohio, that means roughly over 10,000 people on any given day are in Ohio's jail system. So that is a sizable chunk of the electorate that oftentimes does not have the access that they should have and that they are guaranteed to have under state law. And we want to be promoting and protecting the integrity of our election process, not only from security concerns, but also from an access point. An election with integrity requires that all those who are legally able to cast a ballot have the opportunity to do so. So jail voting is a critical component of ensuring election integrity. And also, this is a great opportunity to educate and incentivize some individuals to partake in this very critical work. So one of the first things I want to talk about briefly is the distinction between jails and prisons and why that matters here. And it is important to know that when we're talking about incarcerated individuals, we're talking about those held in our county jails, not our state and federal prisons. And the difference is pretty important. First of all, jails are operated locally, either by a county or a joint county relationship. Prisons are operated by the state or the federal government. And jails typically have a population there that are one, either not currently sentenced, but rather they are in a county jail being held pre-trial, meaning they are legally innocent of their crime or their alleged crime. And so they also are for low-level offenders, once convicted, typically those with misdemeanor accounts and some higher-ranking felony convictions, typically F4s and F5s. Prisons, on the other hand, are for offenders that have been convicted of a higher-level felony, and also the prisons also operate our kind of community-based correctional facilities like halfway houses and drug treatment centers as well. Now, this is an important distinction because in Ohio law, individuals, though Ohio doesn't have the same prohibitions on voting for felons, essentially, like how in Florida until recently, once a person was convicted of a felony, they lost their franchisement rights for the rest of their life. In Ohio, a person only loses their franchisement rights when they are actually serving a sentence for a felony conviction. It is important to understand that this does not apply to those that are currently serving a sentence for a misdemeanor conviction. So that is why we have the difference between jails and prisons. They house traditionally different populations of offenders, with jails being misdemeanors, prisons being felons. And in Ohio law, people that are currently serving time for a misdemeanor offense still have the ability to cast their ballot. those that are serving time for a felony conviction are unable to cast their ballot under state law, but they can once they are released and they re-register to vote. So very important. We're talking jails, not prisons. There are a couple basic rules to follow when we are registering voters in jails or when we are actually helping individuals request their absentee ballots while in jail. The first parameter is, well, who can register voters in jail? And the answer is anybody. There is no prohibition on any individual from going into a jail and helping to register voters and also to have voters fill out an absentee ballot request form. Now, there are a couple different rules in terms of kind of the nuts and bolts of doing a registration drive in a jail setting in Ohio. Most important to remember is that people that are going into these facilities to do voter registration, absentee ballot application assistance cannot be compensated in any way. It's against Ohio law to pay people to register people to vote, and it's especially important to you are not able to pay for the incarcerated individual to register to vote or to cast their ballot. That's a very clear prohibition under Ohio law. So it's very, very important that anybody who volunteers to help with a voter registration drive in our jail system or actually do the absentee ballot drive, they cannot be compensated in any way. It's also to know that the jail does not have to provide the forms that are required for registering voters or for requesting absentee ballots. You will have to bring those forms in with you. But luckily, those forms are readily accessible at a number of different agencies in your county board of elections. There's also registration forms at your local Bureau of Motor Vehicles or your registrar's office. Libraries have voter registration applications and absentee ballot applications as well. So you can stop at any of those, or you can print them off at your home or office if you have those capabilities. So it's just some basic rules around, making sure that people that are doing these registration drives aren't compensated and you have the materials needed when you arrive at the jail, because oftentimes they will not be provided to you. And then last but not least, as I talked about for when we're actually going in and having the folks in our jails requesting their absentee ballots, there are two forms that should be used. And in my interpretation, but I'll leave this up for our experts, Meredith and Lynne, to talk about their experience. I always personally recommend using what's called the 11F form as opposed to the 11A. The 11F form is the absentee ballot application form that is to be used when somebody is in a confined setting, like a nursing home, but also a jail. And voters who are using this 11F form are able to use that facility's address as their voting address, so long as they are confined there. And also the 11F form, and this is the most critically important aspect for me anyway, is that an 11F form gives the voter the opportunity to request an actual physical Board of Elections employees, a two-person bipartisan team of employees, to come to the facility and administer the absentee ballot, rather than having to go through the mail, which we know can be costly and time-consuming. And we're trying to keep those cost barriers to a minimum for folks in jail who typically don't have the resources. Also, finally, on the time frame, absentee ballot requests can be sent either January 1st or 90 days before an election, all the way up until 12 o'clock noon on the Saturday before Election Day. And the applications need to be sent to that county's Board of Elections. And also, most importantly, for folks that are going in and doing these voter registration drives, these voter registration forms must be submitted to the County Board of Election within 10 days of the individual making that request, signing the voter registration form, dating it so it has to be sent back to the County Board of Elections within 10 days of that date for the application and the registration to be valid. So I know that was a lot of information, but I'm going to give Nazik these slides so she can distribute it following the presentation. And I will go ahead and stop so we can hear from our firsthand experts, Lynne and Meredith.
Thank you so much, Collin. We really appreciate it. As Collin mentioned, in his words, he presents the nuts and bolts of the policy around jail voting for people who are currently or previously incarcerated. But our next two guests are going to give us the perspective and the knowledge of people who actually do the work of registering voters in jail in different areas around Ohio. First up, we have Meredith Hellmer, who is an experienced social worker and works with people involved in the criminal justice system since 2003. She's coordinated voter registration in the Cuyahoga County Jail since 2006. She currently serves as the president of the board of Northeast Ohio Voter Advocates and has been a member of their board since 2018. In 2017, she was accepted as an expert panelist by the National Association of Social Workers and contributed to their policy statement on voter participation. She earned a master's degree in social science administration from Case Western Reserve University and a bachelor's degree from Grinnell College. Thank you so much for joining us, Meredith.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. And thank you to Collin and Ray for their information and inspiration as well. So I started registering people to vote in the Cuyahoga County Jail in 2004. And my understanding is its registration started in 2000 in the jail. And I wasn't in Cleveland then, so this is my understanding. This is what's been told to me. I wasn't around. That around 2000, there was a lot of confusion about what really is the law. And can people with felonies vote? And a group of lawyers got together. They called themselves the Free the Vote Coalition. And they did the research and they started registering people to vote in the jail. And one of those jails was the Cuyahoga County Jail. And it started with one of those lawyers. She worked for Lutheran Metropolitan Ministries, and they had a program in the jail. So that was relatively easy to facilitate. Back then it was as simple as asking, can we do registration? And that person moved away. And by 2006, I was still involved in voting stuff, and I'd been hired as a social worker in the court. And I thought I can keep this going. So that's what I did. And initially we did it every other year to match up with the federal elections. But one of the best tips that was given to me was to just do it every year. And that actually really helps. There was so much more continuity with the volunteers and with the jail staff as well. And as Collin talked about, this is really important work because so many people in jail are in jail because they can't afford to pay their bond. Most of them are pretrial defendants. And it's not necessarily realistic to expect a jail to do registration on their own. So it is helpful to have a third party come in, people that really understand these rules, that understand voter registration, to come in and do it. And it is important that they be a nonpartisan group because under the Ohio ethics laws, I don't think the jail would be allowed to allow a partisan group or campaign to come in and do registration. So the process of doing it is, okay, so we used to come, prior to the pandemic, we always came in person to do registration. And Ohio law does sort of restrict how we can do it. There's other models that I think are better, like in Cook County in Chicago. Illinois has same-day registration. And they also have multiple early voting sites. So they set up Cook County Jail as an early voting location, and people can just vote from there. Whereas our process is a little more complicated because we have a 30-day registration window deadline. And also the jail cannot be an early voting site. So we would always go in person towards the end of September, and we would do both registration and absentee ballot requests. And it was very successful. In 2016, that was, I think, our biggest year. We talked to almost 600 people in the jail, and 358 of them voted. So that is a lot of people. This project really can affect people's lives. And then in 2017, 157 people voted in the jail. So even in an off-year election, right, we're still doing pretty well. And then unfortunately, the pandemic happened. So we've had to change how we do things. Now there's a longer process. People in jail have to asked to meet with us via the inmate request system. And then we set up a visitation over Securus. The jail brings them ballots, or not ballots, registration cards and voting forms. And it's just, since it's more complicated, the turnout is lower. So in 2020, the presidential year, we only had 115. And then last year, only 11 people voted. So we are hopeful with COVID rates going down that we'll be able to return to in-person registration. You know, if you want to start this sort of thing, I would say you really need to develop a relationship with a jail. And it is better if there's an insider that can bring it up. Somebody who goes in the jail regularly, somebody who knows the policymakers, the sheriff. It makes it easier if it's a friendly request. And sometimes it helps to just even educate these folks, because a lot of people, even high level people in county government, at the jail, sometimes in the courts, they don't know what the rule is, and they still think that anyone with a felony is not an eligible voter. So it's important just to start with educating the jail about just how many people are eligible voters in the jail, because there are a lot. And then you need to recruit some volunteers and train them. And it's important to train them not just on registration, but also specifically about the 11F and, you know, the felony disenfranchisement rules. So they're comfortable with that. And, you know, a lot of my volunteers initially, they think, I don't know if I want to go into a jail. That sounds like a scary place. And that is somewhat understandable, right? Especially the way we see these things portrayed in the media. And I'm not going to say the jail is like a warm and fuzzy place. It's not, but it's really an orderly place most of the time. I have never had a volunteer tell me they felt unsafe. Never. And I guess one thing that I always tell people is, well, you know, you can be in a library or a grocery store, right? And something can happen. Something can happen anywhere. And when we're in the jail, the odds someone would have a weapon are pretty low, and you're escorted by an officer the whole time. And I have to say, when we are registering voters, they are very polite to us when we come in there. And it's just really neat because there's such a wide variety. You will meet a lot of first-time voters, people that really don't have experience with this stuff. And it's neat because you're talking to them one-on-one. So they really get to ask you questions like, what do you mean by the word ballot? Or, you know, they have the registration card and they'll say, well, where do I write who I need to vote for? So there's really an opportunity to educate people that are not frequent voters and don't understand how the process works. And then you're also going to run into some people that are like regular voters. They do not want to fill out a registration card because they just voted in the primary, which is fine, right? They have the right to decide if they're going to fill out a registration card. We just try and fill it out for everyone because in the jail, we can't bring in devices, so we can't check that they're registered. So that's one technique we use to make sure that everybody does get registered. And it is a really neat thing. And a lot of my volunteers come back year after year after year because they like it. And, they're busy all the time. It's just like a stream of people they bring to you. Whereas, they go to a grocery store and they might get a handful of people in a couple of hours, but in the jail, they're really quite busy and they appreciate that.
Thank you so much, Meredith. I really appreciate you being here to share your direct experience with this work. And I'm sure people will have plenty of questions for you as we conclude with our final speaker, who is Lynne Marshall from the League of Women Voters of Toledo, Lucas County. Lynne has a leadership position with voter service work in the LWV in that area, and she has been doing voter service in the jails for at least a year, as I understand it, at least a year prior to COVID, as I understand it. And thank you, Lynne, for being here. Lynne, you need to unmute yourself.
All right, thank you.
Thank
I didn't
you.
give you all the facts of my life.
No, I might have been apparent. I didn't get that bio from Lynne.
No, that's okay. Sorry about that. We actually got involved or got interested in the jail more because we have for several years been part of a program here in Lucas County from the Reentry Coalition called First Wednesday. And this First Wednesday program is for those out of jail and prison who need assistance, which most all of them do, for housing, jobs, education, banking, all sorts of things. A lot of them come to the meeting also because they can get their driver's license back. So we have been registering voters and checking voter reg for several years at this First Wednesday program. So then we got a connection with a lady who is no longer, but she was a big help, Reem Sube, she worked with ABLE, the legal group here in Toledo. And she worked with us to get a proposal together to be able to go into the jail to register voters. And she also knew the sheriff, Mike Navarre. So we had a Zoom meeting with him and he said, yes, this is great. You guys can come in. So actually our first adventure into the jail was last July. So we haven't been going in that long yet. And we have been going every month. A couple months we couldn't go. It's a second Wednesday of every month because they did not have enough deputies to help us out. So that was again because of COVID, shortage of workers and things like that. But we've been going just every second Wednesday of the month to register the voters. We were asked by the personnel at the jail, and we have been working with Major John Sylvester, if we would send any information that we wanted the people there to have in a PDF format. So we did send all our information with a PDF format because the people at the jail have access to tablets. They don't have online outside access, but they have access internally to the tablets. So we sent them voter reg information. We sent them also I wanted to mention another group that really has been helping us out and working with us that we met through the First Wednesday program. So we also sent things from the Lutheran Social Services for them. But what we found out when we were going in is that most of these people did not read any of the information on their tablets. So we started taking in the cards with us, and every single person that we register is very grateful for these cards. One guy even, he did ask me if somehow we could contact his mother and give his mother the information from Lutheran Social Services. So we did, and she was very grateful for that. So we have 6 people in our group. 4 of them are from the League of Women Voters, and 2 of them are people that we know who volunteer all the time down at the First Wednesday program. So that we have a great relationship with the people at the jail. We also have a very good relationship with our Board of Elections, and we talked to them about the 11F forms. We gave them to some of the people, and then we took them over to the Board of Elections, and then they sent their people in. So I think we're very lucky that we have a good relationship with the Board of Elections and with the jail here, because they have helped us so much. I wanted to mention a couple things that they've helped us with there. We had one person who wanted to register to vote, but he is totally homeless, and he said he was going to be out in a couple weeks. So I contacted our friends at Lutheran Social Services, and they gave me the name of somebody at a community center who will take in homeless and let them use their address. So we did all that, and I got back to the jail and said, could you let him know if he's still there? Well, they got back to me a little bit later and said, oh, unfortunately, he violated something or other and had to go back to prison. But the good part of that is we got a good connection for people that are homeless that don't have any kind of address that they can use. So that was a good thing, because some of the rehab places here or some of the halfway houses, you have to be registered as living at that halfway house to be able to use that address. So that worked out really well for us. And another good example that we had with all the help from the jail was that another young man was in our jail for a while. He technically lives in Michigan, and he asked if we could help him also so he could register. So we went online, got all the information from Michigan for the voter registration, all the help. And I even called the Board of Elections in Lansing, Michigan. They gave me, according to his address, the right county and everything. I talked to them. So I communicated with our people at the jail, and I said, I could bring all that information down. I can even bring an envelope with a stamp, and that way it could be sent to the county he's in Michigan. So they got back and they said that our director of inmate services, Aaron Nolan, said, if you can, just fax us everything. So I faxed it all to them, and it was so wonderful because they got him to fill it all out, and they faxed, and then they mailed all his information to Michigan. So we are, I think here in Lucas County, we are very, very fortunate to get so much assistance from the Board of Elections and from the people that are working at the jail. Now, was I supposed to tell you some other things here?
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's mostly what we wanted to let you know is about how things have been working well for us so far.
Thank you so much, Lynn. I really appreciate it, especially both Lynn and Meredith. I know that there are so many misconceptions about how difficult this might be, or how, like maybe dangerous it might be, or whatever it is. And obviously, it's not going to be a walk in the park, but I feel like you've already begun to help people really demystify this process and let people know that it's not scary and it's not particularly more difficult than registering or informing other voters. Thank you so much to the both of you. I'm going to get started with the Q&A that we have, but as we are going through those, please feel free to continue to drop your questions in the Q&A section. I want to start by asking some questions around how we can hold an open conversation about jail voting in our communities, and overcome common misconceptions and biases. So Raymond, I'll start with you. You had mentioned that you work to help overcome the stigma that incarcerated voters have. And Collin said something. He said every eligible voter should have the right to vote, but this is an Ohio specific thing. And in some states, there are even more difficult restrictions around voting for currently and previously incarcerated individuals. Ray, can you talk to us a little bit about how you feel we can begin to remove the stigma for that population?
Well, I think before you can even get to that population, you have to remove the stigma of voting, period. Particularly those people that are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated, particularly probably didn't vote or didn't care for voting before they went in. I think in this country, in this state, we have a issue with voting for people as opposed to voting around issues. So people become discouraged about voting as a whole. And then as you enter into the prison system, inside of the prison system is where I learned about voting. It's where I learned about the 13th Amendment. It's where I learned about how much government actually affects me. And then upon exiting, understanding that I had this right to vote, that a lot of people I was locked up with that didn't have that right to vote, people that were from Florida who upon release doesn't have the right to vote. And then understanding how important that was, to where the first time I voted was Obama, to vote for Obama and to see things change a little bit was gratifying to me. So I think the first thing we got to do is begin to help people understand how important voting is at around a 5th or 6th grade level. That's when we're starting to develop our own ideologies around the 6th or 7th grade. That's when we begin to start finding our way. And I think that's when we need to understand how much the government plays in our lives at that point. That allows us to grow up with a habit of voting, that allows us to, when we come home from prison, to already get back into that habit of voting. But more importantly, understanding the laws that are directly related to us going to prison. The lack of minimum wage is the reason why, the lack of a living wage is the reason why I ended up in prison. I started selling drugs to take care of my family. I was a single father. It wasn't because I was a bad guy. It was because the job that I had wasn't paying enough to take care of 2 kids and a mortgage. And I learned in prison that that's a direct result of policy. So I think the first we got to do on the front end that prevents us having to re-educate on the back end. And then understanding that people like me, I was a citizen with responsibilities, a mortgage and a father I was a father when I went to prison. And that me going to prison for feeding my family don't change the fact that I'm still a citizen of this state, a citizen of this country. It also doesn't take in the fact that if I didn't do that and my kids would have went hungry, I would have ended up in prison anyway, because they would have took my kids. So either way, I was going to prison without knowing the policies that actually put me in prison, without having a chance to vote on those policies that actually put me in prison. So we have to do a better job on the front end, that it makes our job easier on the back end.
Raymond, thank you so much for sharing about your life with us. It's so important to help educate people, to help gain understanding between and among communities about circumstances that some people might never imagine or might not have ever seen, that might land a person in prison or in jail, and why it's really incumbent upon us to like Collin said, make sure that everybody who has the right to vote is actually able to easily cast that vote, because our democracy is stronger when that happens. And the other thing, one of the things, the many things that you touched on, educating people, civic education from a young age is something that we always talk about at the league. Studies have shown that when people are educated from a young age about the importance of civics and voting, they become lifelong voters. And we always encourage our local leagues to do everything that they have the capacity to do to get involved in educating young people. Just because we can't register them to vote doesn't mean that we don't have something to add there. So I really appreciate you bringing that in. Meredith and Lynn, I'll start with Meredith. Did you want to add anything about how we can begin to have an open conversation about jail voting in communities and help people overcome misconceptions and biases based on your experience?
Well, a lot of things Ray said resonated with me. I think there's probably a lot of folks in jail who are maybe not interested in voting, right? Because the system has let them down, which it has. And even on our biggest years, we're getting maybe 25-30% of the jail come and talk to us. So there's a lot of people in the jail that are still not coming to talk to us. And some of those folks may not be eligible. They could be under some sort of sentence, but it doesn't explain that high of a number, right, of people that are not coming. And I don't know if I have an easy way to answer how to get rid of the stigma around these things, except to just do it. And I'm a social worker, and I like to think that the volunteers that come into the jail with me, they initially really often struggle with this idea that most of the people in the jail have not been convicted. That is something that's really, really hard for them to get their head wrapped around, because it just doesn't seem that American, right? That we lock all these folks up before they're convicted. So in a way, I see it the other way, that these kinds of projects can help criminal justice reform in the long run, right? Now there's more people walking around Cuyahoga County who have some understanding of what bond reform might mean and why we might need it.
Yeah, and as Raymond mentioned, I found it really interesting, Raymond, that you mentioned that it was in jail that you really began to learn about and understand policy and be more interested in voting. And I feel like there's really an opportunity to capitalize on there. You know, Meredith, you mentioned you're not necessarily getting a very large population of the people, you know, a very large number in the prison population, but you've got amazing numbers and a more considerable number than you, like you said, you know, if we were tabling at a supermarket or community center or something like that. Lynn, did you want to add anything on that topic of how we can break down biases and misconceptions?
I think one of the good things for us is, again, I met this person through our first Wednesday participation, and he is a very, very active volunteer person. In fact, he joins us for the prison program, for the jail program. I was going to use the wrong terminology. I was going to say he's an ex-con, but the sheriff told me we don't use that. We say restored citizen. So this person that works with us is a restored citizen. And we thought that it might, if we could maybe get some of these other people that come to these meetings that have been in jail or in prison, if we could get some of those people involved in getting the word out, that would really help, that would really help a lot of the other people there, you know, or the people in the community. So that's one of the things that we thought about. there are some other activities going on, you know, not all the time, but there are other activities where you go to some of these areas where the people do not vote as much, they do not register to vote. And sometimes if you can even try to be there at the event and encourage people to vote, we do get more people registered. Now, it would be great to know that they really did vote, but we don't have a program yet to have that, to be able to track that.
Thank you, Lynn. Our next question, we have lots of questions just around kind of like the some details about this work. So Collin, this one might be for you. If a person is registered to vote from jail and then goes to trial and is convicted of a felony, does anyone notify the BOE of this change in status?
So that's a really good question. And in theory, yes. In theory, yes. Somebody, and typically in this scenario, it is the Common Pleas clerk, it is the county clerk that will transmit that information to actually to the Secretary of State's office, which then essentially passes that along to the county board of elections. However, what we have seen and what we have found is that this data that the clerk is transmitting, one, is not timely, and two, it's very basic information. It's not very detailed. And that's important because in Ohio, when you are simply convicted of a felony, you know, the most common thing we think of is that, okay, well, they're convicted and then they're, you know, put in a facility where they are actually incarcerated at the time. That is not always the case. Sometimes folks can be convicted, but then can have some sort of community control provision, typically for a low-level felony, like an F5 or even an unspecified felony conviction. So when somebody is convicted of a low-level felony, but their conviction comes with, like I said, a community control or a probation sentence for a number of years, Ohio law does not consider that person to be incarcerated. In order to be considered legally incarcerated, you have to be physically in the institution. So when the county clerk records that somebody was convicted, they simply put that information into a spreadsheet associated with that offender's name, and they transmit that. And you lose the details of the actual experience. So they see convicted. So oftentimes that data is not double checked, and it is often inputted into the county board of elections system that would rescind that voter's voter registration, even though they may never have been actually incarcerated. And that's a problem that we see where people who are working their way through the criminal legal system have their voter registrations erroneously deleted because there is not this distinction made in these reports to the Secretary of State's office. So that's a frustrating reality of the current system. We're actually in the works with trying to identify better ways to get more accurate and complete information in the hands of the Secretary of State and the Board of Elections to try to make sure that these errors don't occur and that folks who still have their franchise rights are able to exercise them without I guess I would say without an error or a mistake being made by government officials.
Thank you, Collin. I have a few questions next about the process of actually voting when a person is in jail. So if a person finds themselves in jail, let's say in the month prior to election day, and they want to vote, will they necessarily know that they're going to be or not going to be out of jail by election day? Let's say if they're being, held until trial. Or should they, sorry, I should clarify, or should they assume that they're going to be in jail and make arrangements to vote that way?
I can answer this if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you. Meredith.
So people often don't know.
Yeah, that's right.
It's things get continued. People are usually in jail longer than they would expect. And then some days, the judge is feeling good and releases them on a personal bond, right? So what we encourage people who don't know, we do encourage them to request a ballot in the jail, because if they don't, then they're sort of out of luck. But if they get released, they can still vote. If they do early voting, they can vote a regular ballot. And if they show up at the polls and it says that they've requested a ballot, sent to the jail, then they would vote provisionally.
And is their only option to vote by essentially mail-in voting, using one of those two forms that Collin mentioned?
No.
I believe so. I think. Oh, go ahead, Lynn.
Oh, yeah. No, I was going to say the time that we have done it, and we don't have as much experience as Meredith does, but we spoke with the Board of Elections first and told them this is what we were going to do. We took the 11F forms in, and then we took them back to the Board of Elections, and then they went and made, let people vote. But the same thing she said, they don't know, and we don't know whether they're going to be out or not. And the information she gave about, even going and doing a provisional if you are out, so that's been our experience so far, but no one knows for sure when they're going to be released, or if they're waiting for trial, if they're going to end up in the prison.
Yeah, and I think it's important that we continue to educate and normalize voting, because this is there's a lot of stops in this. There's a lot of steps and stops. So the first thing is understand that if you have been convicted of a felony and you are still engaged in an activity that could possibly get you arrested, your chances of being arrested between August and October go up. They look to take people off the streets between August and October, particularly those people that have the propensity of going to jail, because that decreases the voting population. That you will see that happening in low-income communities. Highway patrol begin to ride around. More people become incarcerated at that time. You will see those things happen. Then once they go to jail, you don't know what your bail is going to be. You don't know if, like they said, if it's going to be a continuance. So you really don't know. So it becomes on us to continue to negotiate and continue to have a relationship with the jails that allows for every week we're in there not only registering, but giving people absentee ballots. But then we have to get to a place that we know when election time is every year. We know that there's people that are in jail that have not been convicted of a felony. Why aren't they able to vote while they're there? Why don't we have 2 or 3 voting booths just for that population? So this is on the front end and the back end. We are actively arresting people to ensure that they don't make it to the polls. Those people that are getting arrested don't have time to think about where can I vote at while I'm in here. They're thinking about how to get out. That becomes on us as a public to say that there are citizens and they have the right and deserve the right, and you must allow them to vote by any means necessary, whether it's absentee ballot, but we prefer to have voting booths in jails. And then we have to carry the water of those people that are being incarcerated, because the last thing they're thinking about is voting. They're thinking about surviving in conditions that can be death if they take their eye off of the prize, which is ultimately survival and getting out.
Thank you, Raymond. So I want to break this down for a minute. There are so many things that we can take from this. Not only do we have opportunities here to engage in voter service work, we have the opportunity here to engage in advocacy work on behalf at the state level, at the county level, to all of the things that Raymond is saying to make sure that people are not being excessively incarcerated at times like this, to make sure that people have greater justice, that they're not being imprisoned for longer periods of time than they should be. There is, criminal justice, advocacy, voter advocacy. There's so many opportunities here to begin to rectify the wrongs on this population. We are coming up on the hour and we have so many questions. I want to wrap up by asking about people who may be under parole, if they are released under parole, or if they are under community control or other situations. Are they able to register and vote? Collin, can you take that one?
Yeah. And the simple answer is, and I want to stress this is a simple answer. It's not, going to be, it doesn't apply to all situations as we've talked. Every single person who comes in contact with the criminal legal system has a unique and different experience and set of circumstances that they have to operate within. Typically speaking, though, yes, an individual is able to re-register and vote if they are in a community control setting, if they're on probation. Yes, more often than not, they are able to exercise that right. The problem is nobody tells them they can't. As Ray said, they're not thinking about when they're going to be able to go cast their next ballot. They're thinking about where are they going to get their next meal from, oftentimes, when they come out of these institutions. So that's another part of advocacy we need to be working on, a comprehensive reentry program that discusses and shares, and not only just kind of gives information, but, helps these people and gives them, the guidance that they need to use the resources that are available, though we need more resources, to use the ones that are available to have a more seamless transition into society and back into everyday life. Voting is a major part of feeling as a citizen and feeling as a valued individual in this society. And so I believe a critical component to any healthy and robust reentry system has to be getting people re-registered and incentivizing them to vote as soon as possible. And unfortunately, that is just not the case currently in the state.
Thank you so much, Collin, and thank you to everyone for being here, and thank you to our speakers. We will need to wrap up as we are at the top of the hour. I just want to close off by saying I hope that all of you are not only better informed, but that you are motivated to get out and to help serve justice for this community, for this population that really needs all of our help in order to help restore their rights and to help them exercise their rights. Thank you again for everyone, and have a good rest of your week.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Yeah.